All right, so we are moving on to our next panel now, which is the Occupational Motor Vehicle panel. And our first speaker is Dr. Caitlin Pope. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Health, Behavior, and Society and is a faculty associate in the Kentucky Injury Prevention and Research Center in the College of Public Health at the University of Kentucky. She received her PhD in developmental psychology from the University of Alabama at Birmingham and completed her postdoctoral training at the Center for Injury Research and Policy at the Abigail Wexner Research Institute at Nationwide Children's Hospital. Whew, that's a mouthful. Her research takes a lifespan approach to understand the complex associations between age-related changes, neurocognitive burden, and outcomes that reflect an individual's ability to maintain safe and independent function in later life. And the overall goal for research is to prevent unintentional injuries, support and sustain functional independence, and promote healthy adult development and aging. She'll be speaking to us this morning about a project that she is working on with us that's under the Occupational Safety and Health Surveillance Program, and she's the co-investigator for it. It is called the Occupational Motor Vehicle Injury Surveillance System in Kentucky.
I think I know how to still present in front of people. This is like only the second time I've done it since COVID started, so I'm going to fumble my way through it. So thank you for the opportunity to talk this morning about the surveillance project that we have ongoing at the University of Kentucky. My background is in driver behavior and driver safety from a psychological perspective, but I do take a lens of including the environment into this. And so when I came to University of Kentucky and started working with Dr. Terry Bunn, I had never really thought about occupation health as an area for my research, but I've learned a lot from her so far, and I really do appreciate the interdisciplinary perspective we take at UK in terms of motor vehicle safety and how it relates to occupational health. So I'd just like to mention the rest of the team who is unfortunately not here today. So our PI, Dr. Nick Samadiatis, he's in the Department of Civil Engineering, as well as our co-investigators at the Kentucky Transportation Center, and our project manager, Madison Leaford. We couldn't get anything done without her in that role. So, for today's talk, I'll briefly explain the cautious expanded program that we have at the University of Kentucky, as ONVIS is a sub-project of it. I'll talk about why occupational motor vehicle crashes are important in terms of occupational health research, and then I'll go over some of our project goals as well as the things that we've been doing over the last year and we plan to start in year 2, as well as some future directions. So it's important to note that our cautious expanded program at Kentucky has been NIOSH funded since 2005 to date. I think it allows us to provide continuity in terms of the services and research that we do. So without this funding, we wouldn't be able to get this work done. But during this time period, what we've noticed and what we've seen, and all of y'all in this room know, is that there has been a significant decrease in both fatal and non-fatal occupational injuries in Kentucky as well as in the United States. So it's kind of hard to see the numbers. I wouldn't pay attention to the numbers so much, but to look at the actual figures in the line. So in the red and in the orange, you'll see that's Kentucky and compared to the blue, which is the United States. And so while there's variation in terms of how much of a problem it is, and then how much that, the degree of change that we see, it has declined over the last 2 decades. But there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. So when looking at Kentucky's standings, we are the 12th worst state for non-fatal occupational injuries and the 20th worst state for fatal occupational injuries and illnesses. So we've come a long way, but we still have a lot to do. So in terms of talking about occupational motor vehicle crashes, in Kentucky as well as the United States, it is a leading cause of worker injury fatality. And when we look at our crash data sources and our workers' compensation data sources in Kentucky, what we see is that it is a leading cause of work-related death. And when we look specifically at the crash data, we see that 44% of fatal crashes actually involve a semi-truck. So from this research, though, and the data sources that we use, we can determine that there probably is a high likelihood that we are underestimating the injury risk in terms of occupational motor vehicle crashes. And one of the primary reasons we know this is because we are relying on single-source databases. So we have our crash database and our workers' compensation database, which we derive our occupational health indicators from. But the reality is that neither, especially when looking at crash, there's not clear coding in terms of work-relatedness. Also, as the transportation industry has changed over the years, and we see the advent of more gig workers, we know that there are a lot of industries right now that are relying on light and medium vehicles. And if these individuals are exempt from workers' compensation coverage or they opt out, then we lose the ability to then identify them in workers' compensation data. So it's hard to determine the crashes in the crash database, but it's also hard to determine whether or not they exist if they don't have workers' compensation. They'll never exist in that database. So ultimately what we have is a lack of data support, a lack of data to support investigations in occupational motor vehicle crashes when they deal with smaller vehicles. So that's why we started the OMVIS project here at the University of Kentucky. So our main goal was to improve occupation motor vehicle crash identification by looking at certain vehicle types that are not currently classified as occupational related. Obviously, it's really easy to pick out semi-trucks in these data sets. The ambiguity happens when you start looking at passenger cars and light trucks and whether or not they were work-related. From there, we want to extend and develop a new occupational health indicator to identify whether a crash involved a driver or a passenger that was on the job. So of course we care about those who are driving, who are the worker, but what about the individual especially who's taking Ubers or Lyfts to work, or they may be going in between jobs and they may be a passenger in the car. So we don't want to forget about them as well. And then from there, we really want to use this information to promote targeted communication to industry stakeholders and to inform and enhance total worker safety programs and policies in Kentucky. So our project process is an iterative process. First, it's finding the right data sources and establishing a database for this multi-source surveillance. And then from there, actually creating the database using probabilistic linkage, and I'll talk about that in just a second. After we have our database created and evaluated, the next goal is then to conduct some epidemiological analyses using the data. And part of that is to identify occupational motor vehicle high crash corridors and locations, so helping provide stakeholders with the information that they need to know in terms of driver safety and where these crashes are happening. As with all projects, we care about disseminating our applications and research findings, and then ultimately, because this is a database that we are creating through linkage, we want to be able to evaluate and assess the overall program at every step of the process. So what we learn at each year, we then fold back into the process for creating the overall database so that it can be sustainable and potentially replicated in other states. So I mentioned earlier that we've been relying on single source databases in Kentucky. The two current databases that we rely on are our crash data from 2000 until now, as well as our workers' compensation data. These are the new sources that we've been identifying as potential sources to add in and to link with our crash and workers' comp data. So we have inpatient hospitalization and ED data, trauma registry data, EMS data, death data, our Kentucky Highway Information System, which relies on GIS, as well as demographic mapping software, which is a US RAP tool that I'll mention in a second. So year one, we just finished up year one. What we really spent year one doing was reviewing 2020 single source databases so that we could identify, one, whether or not those databases we could actually pull occupation-related motor vehicle crashes out of it, and then also identifying different fields and variables that we would need for probabilistic linkage. So when we took a heavy lift and look at the crash data, what we saw was what we pretty much already knew, but we wanted to make sure that was really the case. So it's really easy to identify commercial motor vehicles when you use crash databases, right? It's easy to tell that it's a semi-truck, even to some extent a work van, because those NCIC codes exist. Where the ambiguity started to happen was whether or not it involved passenger cars or light trucks. Crash data is just simply not set up to use it in that way. And so what we decided to do was to work with the Kentucky Transportation Center to start doing preliminary mining of crash narratives. So trying to find keywords and phrases that we could then use with language processing and artificial intelligence so that once we identify the words that would help us figure out whether or not these light and medium vehicles were work-related, we could then derive an algorithm and then put it through that process to speed up the entire process. We were also doing a similar and parallel work with our EMS data. So our Kentucky EMS data is a very fruitful data source that has not been used historically for research as well as public health initiatives. And as you can guess, with EMS data, there's a lot of crash-related injuries, right? They're usually, first on the scene. And so they actually have within our database an indicator for occupation, yet we know there's probably some issues with it. So our goal is to start there and then try to expand from that so that we pick up any extra cases that maybe EMS didn't identify. And so using the dispatch complaints reported in combination with the EMS narratives that they have in that database, it seems very fruitful to start linking with our crash data. Ultimately, though, like I said before, the goal is to make keywords so that we can then identify vehicle types as well as work-related duties and professions. So what we were seeing in the EMS data that you don't get in the crash data was that the EMS narrative included what the worker was potentially doing, what they were wearing, where the crash actually happened. So those are all additional information that could be used to help support identifying these crashes through the crash database. So we're now starting year 2 of our database creation. The goal for us is to start with the 2020 data, since we know it so well, and develop a pilot database so that we can start to evaluate the accuracy of it after linkage. Once we establish this pilot database, then we can then apply the process to all the years prior. So we're doing a twofold approach. So the first approach is that we are systematically identifying potential occupation-related motor vehicle crashes using the crash narrative. So again, extending that idea of using naturalistic language processing as well as artificial intelligence to get more out of those crash data as quickly as possible. But at the same time, we're probabilistically linking the data that we have. So using crash, EMS, workers' comp, death data, and hospitalization data, we're taking the non-unique data elements such as time, location, incident, and we're creating a probabilistically linked database to start doing analyses with and to start comparing to the crash data that we have that is being mined with the narratives. At the same time, we're going to start applying the US RAP tools to the database, the crash database and the workers' comp database that we have. So this provides a way to do GIS-based visual aids that will help identify crash hotspots and corridors. And then once this database is created, again, we're going to evaluate it with probabilistic linking. The issue is accuracy. And so with the imputed databases that we have, we want to make sure that we're actually identifying the right crashes. So future directions. So once this database is created and we have something that we know is as accurate as it can be, we then have 3 pilot projects that we'll be implementing with the data itself. So the first is to identify light and medium occupational motor vehicle crashes so that we can identify worker and vehicle characteristics, crash details, as well as post-crash outcomes. The second is then we will be providing stakeholders with crash risk maps for commercial vehicle crash locations. So from these maps, we'll be able to give them crash density, crash rates, rate ratios, as well as potential crash savings. The third project, which I will be leading, given my background in gerontology and aging and health behavior, is looking at age-related occupation motor vehicle crash injuries. So we know that our population overall is aging and that these individuals are staying in the workforce. And from a healthy aging perspective, we want them in the workforce. We want individuals, if they want to continue to work as long as they would like to. But we have to make sure that that environment is safe for everyone. And so now that we'll have a database created where we can look at injuries and just not fatalities, my goal with this pilot project is to assess both pre-crash factors as well as post-crash outcomes for the aging workforce in terms of occupation-related safety with motor vehicle crashes. So with that, I'd like to acknowledge our funding from NIOSH, all the faculty and staff at Kiprick, as well as our support from the College of Public Health, as well as the College of Engineering and the Kentucky Transportation Center. And I'll take questions now. But if you don't have any questions, please do connect with me on Twitter. I am active on Twitter. Please connect with our Injury Center Kiprick on Twitter, as well as Instagram.
Where are you guys getting your GIS markers for the crashes? Are EMS workers recording it as they go?
This is a good question. So I'm not an expert in GIS, so if the answer I give you isn't enough, please do connect with me and I can connect you with our GIS specialist. So within our EMS data, we do have latitude and longitude markers. So I would assume that would be the way that we would be doing GIS. And it's the same for the crash data as well.
So I was wondering if you could go a little bit more into detail about like the data mining techniques that you guys use to like identify keywords in the crash narratives and that natural language processing piece.
Yeah, no, it's a really cool thing. It's not easy by any means. So what I will say first and foremost about narratives is that we can only do as much with what they write, right? So in terms of both crash and EMS, it's crazy. You'll have some people who put one sentence, and that's probably what it was intended to be, just one very concise sentence about the situation. And then especially in the EMS data, you have like a paragraph sometimes with all these details about the vehicle, about the worker, about the situation. So it will vary. So the goal for us first was, this is a project that Kentucky Transportation Center was already doing, so we're combining synergies so that we can use the efforts on the end. But ultimately, we look at different vehicle types. We look at whether or not it's noted that it was a work-related on-duty situation. The problem with some emergency vehicles, like police cruisers, is that we have to determine whether or not they were on a call versus maybe they were going home and they take their cruisers home with them. But then once that process happens, we train graduate students to then start picking out the information. And then once they pick out the information, they then give it to the language processing software that they use to compare. So that's the stage that we're at now, where we're trying to identify whether or not the crash data can be used in this way. We know the EMS data can, depending from the information that we saw. It's a really long time, but once we can identify the right keywords and the right phrases, then it should speed the process up very much. But if you're more interested in language processing, I'd love to connect you with Kentucky Transportation Center if you send me an email. The people that are over that project can probably give way better details than I have. I will say that it is only the EMS stations or the EMS companies that report to the state. When we met with the board of EMS, the person who handles the data, he did make that note that there's certain places in Kentucky that don't report to Kentucky EMS, but that the data does update very frequently throughout the week. We do know that there will be duplicates, whether it's different stations were called, or it just, data itself is messy. So those are some of the challenges that we anticipate in year 2 as we're trying to link the data sources together. But from what I can tell for Kentucky EMS, we have a very large group of people who actually report into the EMS registry.
Yeah, I think the coverage rate is about at least 95%. So we do get the bulk of the data in Kentucky. And then your other question, sorry, what was the last part of the question?
Is fire and rescue included in that too, or is it just?
Right. If they have EMS as part of the fire and rescue, I believe they are included in that. And then you asked one other part of that question.
That was about dedupe.
Oh, yes, the dedupe. We do receive the duplicates, but in our data cleaning, then we receive the duplicate data records. So, okay, our next speaker for this panel is Dr. Erin Mabry. She is a senior research associate within the Division of Freight Transit and Heavy Vehicle Safety at the Virginia Tech Transportation Institute, and her research experience focuses on driver health, sleep disorders, fatigue, impairment, and implications of these factors on roadway safety. Dr. Mabry currently leads health research initiatives for the division for DHVY, and has conducted health, sleep, and fatigue research with heavy vehicle drivers to inform best practices and guides for implementing health and sleep disorder programs for the trucking industry. Dr. Mabry has contributed to all aspects of large-scale human research projects, including developing, writing, reviewing, and critiquing research proposals, protocols, and final reports, researching and writing literature reviews, recruiting research subjects, designing and conducting questionnaires, interviews, and focus groups, and performing advanced statistical analyses and analyzing data, as well as writing and presenting research findings. So welcome, Dr. Mabry.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm Erin Mabry. I am a senior research associate at the Virginia Tech Transportation Institute with the Division of Freight, Transit, and Heavy Vehicle Safety. And I'd love to talk to you today about a project that we completed and was published in 2020. So this is really the first time I'm getting to talk about it in person. So I'm really excited about that. This was a 5-year project funded by the DOT. It was conducted between 2012 and 2017, and the final reports were just published in 2020. So the primary objectives of this project were to examine and discuss the prevalence of demographic characteristics, work experience, and lifestyle and behavioral habits, in addition to medical conditions, for up to 21,000 commercial motor vehicle drivers. We also identified personal, medical, and situational factors that contribute to or increase their risk for crashes or moving violations. And a third primary objective was to identify factors that were associated with the presence of obstructive sleep apnea in this population. And then finally, this was a prospective study in Nature where we were able to follow these commercial drivers and their safety records for up to 3 years during data collection. So to just briefly go over the methods, we were able to recruit drivers at their driver orientation. That was how we were able to get this study out in front of so many drivers in order to recruit the 21,000. That was our goal. So there were 7 major hiring sites across the country for this large for-hire carrier that we partnered with on this research. And then towards the end of the study, we partnered with a local occupational health clinic that conducted medical exams for drivers to just get us over the line of that 21,000. So drivers every week, they would come to orientation at the for-hire carrier. They were exposed to this study with a recruitment video that we were able to play, and then collect their driver survey at that higher orientation. So we were able to recruit just over 11,000 commercial drivers that elected to participate, and they completed this initial driver survey for us. So as you can imagine, the other drivers, so that was about a response rate of about 60%. 60% of the drivers that went through orientation over the course of the 3 years of recruitment elected to participate and complete that survey for us. The other drivers, we were only able to get medical information from them. So the carrier at the time conducted a full medical exam for all new hire drivers, and we were able to tap into that database of information for drivers that did not elect to complete this driver survey. 2 years into data collection, the carrier switched their practices, and they began accepting a brief medical exam for drivers that were coming in at hire that had a 6-month or newer complete medical exam. So for those drivers that we were recruiting at that point, we were only able to get a brief medical screen from them, so almost about 6,000 of those drivers. Every month during the 3 years of data collection, we were obtaining safety records from the carrier. This included on-road crashes as well as the off-road kind of minor property damage only crashes, which we excluded from our analyses. We were more concerned with what was happening on road, the more severe crashes. Also during data collection, we were able to obtain monthly crash data information from MCMIS. And as you can imagine, there was a lot of overlap between what we were obtaining from MCMIS and the carrier crashes. So we primarily used the MCMIS data to track drivers that left the carrier over the course of that tenure, and we were able to continue tracking them and their crash records if they were hired by another company. And then we were also able to obtain SIDLIS records post hoc for moving violation and convictions. So this is just a summary of the data collection materials that we were able to obtain. So as I mentioned, all the new hire drivers that came into the carrier for the majority of our data collection period completed a full medical examination report. So this includes biographical information, physiological information, as well as items related to 64 different medical and health conditions. For drivers that came in during the last year of our data collection period that had a full medical exam at hire with the carrier, they completed a brief medical exam. So at that point, we were only able to obtain demographic information and information on blood pressure and heart rate. And then drivers that elected to participate completed an initial driver survey. So this included some demographic information as well as self-reported information about their sleep habits, their lifestyle habits, nutrition, exercise, training that they received, driving experience, that sort of thing. Then all drivers that completed that driver survey also completed the Epworth Sleepiness Scale to look at daytime sleepiness. They completed the Berlin Questionnaire to look at a self-screening tool for sleep apnea, as well as a survey of recent life experience to look at recent life experiences that may or may not contribute to stress or daily hassles that may impact safety. And then a driver doula dangerous driving index tool, which looked at different aspects of driving behavior, including related to safety, including hostility and anger expressed while driving. And then finally, a social desirability scale that looked at, we threw that in there just to see what percentage of drivers are just trying to appear in a favorable light and may not be responding truthfully to the survey. So data entry was all questionnaire data was double entered, and then we were able to impute the medical examination report. The really kind of novel thing that we did with this piece of the data was going through the freehand medical examiner comments that are throughout this medical form that aren't self-report by driver. They're freehand comments from the medical examiner, and we were able to code all the medical conditions according to this. So there's 3 sections on the 649 long form that include open-ended comments. 2 of those are completed by the medical examiner. And so they would leave comments such as, driver presents with obesity, complains of fatigue, and is a snorer, recommend for a sleep apnea test. That's just an example of a comment that you would see that wouldn't necessarily be captured on the 649 with that binary yes or no if you have a sleep disorder or history of sleep disorders. So we were able to go through the 649 form and all of those sections completed by the medical examiner where there were open-ended comments. We are able to tag different medical conditions and then assign it a treatment or diagnosis option. So we were able to say if a current condition is diagnosed, if it's potential, so the medical examiner made a comment about it, but we don't know if it was diagnosed or not, or if we were unsure or unclear about the condition. And then after that, we were able to say whether the condition is being treated from the comments, not being treated, or if that information was unclear. So this is a really novel thing that we were able to do with these 21,000 medical exams that, as you can imagine, took a lot of time, but was really impactful in terms of what we saw with the data. So this just gives an idea of how the data is sparsed out with consented and unconsented drivers. So the drivers that completed that initial driver survey are in that top circle. So if they just completed the survey, there was just a few of them, over 1,000. We had almost 8,000 that completed the initial driver survey, and we had a full medical exam, and then the overlap between just the brief medical for those drivers that came in during our last year of recruitment. So this is how we get to our 20,753 unique drivers that we had at least 1 point of data collection for, and we included them in our analyses. So to go over the descriptive results, so 96% of our study drivers were male. We ended up looking at them in age quartiles to kind of control for that age and experience factor that I'll go into in a little bit more detail later. Almost 90% of the drivers were overweight or obese. About half were married. So I want to reiterate that this is self-report. This is self-report information on that initial driver survey. 63% reported that they used tobacco. You can see the breakdown for caffeine consumption, alcohol consumption, napping behavior. 34% indicated that they were not on a regular sleep schedule, and 54% indicated they were sometimes on a regular sleep schedule. And then the nightly sleep drivers, 73% of them indicated that they got 7 or more hours of sleep per night. This is much higher than other studies have reported that look at objective data. So just want to be careful and cautious of that this is self-report. So onto the analysis approach. So we were able to follow these drivers for up to 3 years, depending on when they entered the study, follow them prospectively across their driving and safety behavior habits. As I mentioned, we stratified by age quartiles so that we could potentially look at the confounding and interacting effects of age. So we looked at each age quartile separately to adjust for that, as well as BMI. And then a stepwise regression looking at these different variables in a stepwise approach. And then we had 4 outputs of data that we were primarily interested in. So the National Crash Database that is DOT reportable only and come from MCMIS. Then we have the National Moving Violation Conviction Database where we looked at moving violations and convictions. And then we had the carrier crash data files. And as I mentioned, we were only looking at on-road crashes where we're not interested in the property damage, only minor crashes. And we were also able to look at them as preventable and non-preventable as coded by the carrier. So this just shows how we prospectively followed these drivers. So we saw a lot of drivers that would come in at higher, and we'd start tracking them at that point. And then they may leave, and then we lose track of them for a little bit, and then they come back and they get hired at another point in time. So we saw this a lot, and we called them orientation hoppers. And so this just gives kind of a visual of how we kept track of them in the study. So they hire into the study at the start of time A. Say they leave, and they're termed at the end of time A. During that time B, if they're still driving, we're able to follow their crash behavior safety records in MCMIS with their national crashes if they have a crash. And then say they come back and they rehire with the carrier at another time point, they're back in the study until they leave again or until the end of data collection, which was May of 2016. So now the key findings. So to answer the research question of which predictors were associated with the diagnosis of OSA, BMI was the big one. BMI, if they had a BMI greater than 39, 3/4 of those drivers had OSA. 3/4 of those drivers that were diagnosed had a BMI greater than 39. And this is a certain diagnosis from a medical examiner that was in our records, diagnosed and treated. Drivers that had a high BMI, so BMI over 35 and also had hypertension, 75% of those drivers had OSA. So the big predictors were BMI, high blood pressure, and age. So you can see this kind of this splits down across this. So if they had BMI high, yes, no, and then if they had yes, then you have high blood pressure plays into that, and that is where you get that 75% of those diagnosed OSA drivers were in that category of having a high BMI and having high blood pressure. So the big 3 were BMI, high blood pressure, and age. And then to answer the question of which medical conditions and treatments had an impact on future crash and or moving violation risks. So this was really interesting and is supported by other literature out there that drivers being treated for medical conditions were no riskier than drivers without the same medical condition. So healthy control drivers without the condition. And in some age groups, the treated drivers were actually less riskier than the medical conditions. So we saw that drivers that had OSA but were being effectively treated for their condition reduced their crash risk by about 40%. However, if they had OSA and they were not receiving treatment, they increased their crash risk by 200%. Hypertension followed a similar trend. The drivers who had hypertension diagnosed but were being treated, they reduced their crash risk, and you get that range by the different age quartiles that I mentioned we looked at. But drivers that were hypertensive not receiving treatment or not receiving effective treatment had an increased crash risk by 30 to 200%. So that was really striking. And then did prior moving violations have an impact on future crash risk and or moving violation risks? So you can imagine this could come into play with pre-employment screening practices, looking at driver's history and if it's predictive of future crash risk. So we saw that drivers with a self-reported moving violation in the last 3 years, so this was taken from that initial driver survey where we asked about their moving violation history, they were 40 to 60% more likely to be involved in a crash than drivers of similar age without prior moving violations. And again, you get this range because we looked at the age quartiles of drivers. And then, did driver age and driver experience have an impact on future crash and or moving violation risks? So we saw that it did. Because age and experience were so closely correlated, we did not include experience in our model. We just included age. But each yearly increase in age reduced the likelihood of a moving violation, a national crash, and a carrier preventable crash by these percentages. So other takeaways, we saw that although obesity was highly prevalent among the study sample, obesity itself did not increase crash or violation risk. It was the untreated comorbid conditions that are highly associated with obesity, sleep apnea, hypertension, high blood glucose. It was those comorbid conditions that increased crash risk. Because we saw that young drivers who were obese or overweight, but who did not have these comorbid medical conditions yet, did not have an increase in safety risk. The most common diagnosed medical groupings in the study population we found was high blood pressure, diabetes, and sleep apnea. All of these prevalence factors were higher than the national population, but some of them are also still lower than we see in other populations of commercial drivers, especially sleep apnea. So although we were able to find a lot of these by doing that coding analysis that I mentioned for the medical exam, I think there's still some that were missed there. And then we saw that there was a strong effect of age and safety events on relationship of age to BMI. So you have the caveat that older drivers, they have more experience, so they're safer. But older drivers also have more medical conditions that cause them to have increased safety risk later in life. So it's kind of a confounding issue that we were able to parse out by looking at those age quartiles of drivers. So as I mentioned, that kind of interplay between age, BMI, medical conditions, and safety is a great stepping off point to inform a future longitudinal study that we hope to do here soon. We saw that a high prevalence of obesity and obesity-related comorbid conditions were present in this population of 21,000 drivers. We saw that the questionnaires that are often used with light vehicle drivers or other study populations may not be appropriate for this group in terms of honesty on self-report tools. So we need to be careful when we're looking at that self-report tools and information in this population. And then another takeaway was that the requirements for medical certification are working. So drivers, as long as they are diagnosed and being treated for many of the medical conditions that we know impact safety, are largely as safe or safer than their healthy counterparts. Many of the predictors for sleep apnea are looked at or are the same across the stop bang analysis tool. So we're looking at that as a future kind of first line tool to look at screening for sleep apnea among commercial drivers, because it includes a variety of self-report and objective data that we know objective data is going to be the big telltale signs for sleep apnea prediction. We know that fleets have a high rate of characteristics and behaviors associated with these comorbid health conditions. We saw a high prevalence of smoking and overweight and obesity among these drivers, so targeting those for health interventions would be a first priority. As I mentioned, the pre-employment screening can be an effective tool to identify how moving violations can be predictive of future crash risk. And then treating health conditions instead of discriminating by health conditions can actually be healthier and safer for drivers. So just to touch on the limitations that we had, many of our medical conditions that we looked at in the study, we had a limited sample size, so we weren't able to actually see many trends with many of the medical conditions that were less prevalent among this group. The exposure that we were using to track drivers across the 3 years of data collection was measured in calendar days rather than miles traveled or hours driving, so that was a limitation. The drivers that completed the initial driver survey were a convenient sample, although they were representative of drivers across the country, so that was a strength. And then the treatments for medical conditions did not ultimately consider type or efficacy always. And then, as I mentioned, once drivers left the participating carrier, if we lost track of them in MCMIS, we didn't know whether they left the industry or whether they were just really safe and not having crashes. So that was an assumption that we had to make with the analyses. And I'll take any questions you have at this time.
So is this the right audience to really have a great campaign for be a driver, be healthy? I mean, basically, you've got all of these metrics that are associated with really bad outcomes, right? And you have an audience, right? A target audience of people who drive for a living and or drive a lot, and they have nothing to lose but their lives, right? So theoretically, if it's put right, if there's the right social marketing, they're a really remarkable captive audience to develop an implementation program for a bigger kind of like a movement to make that industry appealing, right? To actually shift. And all of those things are just typical. They're all lifestyle issues.
Right. And I think the takeaway is that treated effectively, the drivers are just as safe as those that are completely healthy.
But can you use these data to actually start a campaign to actually make the drivers, the leaders, to be healthier? Because they have incentive if it's couched correctly.
Yes, they do have incentive, and carrier health programs are becoming increasingly popular, but I hear it all the time that it's really hard to get drivers to buy into those. There have to be like monetary incentives to get them to actively participate. So that's always going to be a limitation and something that we have to be creative about to get them involved.
I think intervention is clearly a question, but this is a great cohort. I mean, this is fabulous. Probably one of the best in the country in this kind of topic. Are you hoping to keep it going? Is there additional funding coming down the pike, or?
So we've branched off to just some little side projects using the data. The Stop Bang screening tool that I mentioned, I'm doing a paper right now that is applying the Stop Bang in that population to look at the prevalence using that tool to see how effective it is in comparison to the drivers we know were diagnosed. So there's little spin-off projects, but it's mainly data mining efforts. No large-scale funding to continue it at this time.
I had a question about your data collection. So how are you able to differentiate between drivers that crash due to health issues, or was the crash maybe someone else's fault?
So it wasn't, we weren't able to determine cause. It was just associations. What was their medical status and their crash profile versus healthy drivers without the medical condition and their health profile. So all just relationships, no causal things were made.
Okay, one more question.
Sure.
Did you also track drivers who maybe had no medical history?
Oh, yeah.
Prior? Okay.
Yep. So are you talking about like the completely healthy drivers that had no conditions?
Yeah,
Yep.
so, okay.
Yep. So there were, when we looked at the data for medical conditions specifically, it was looking at diagnosed treated versus diagnosed untreated versus potential versus healthy, no issues. So we looked at, and all of those were compared against each other. And I have some additional slides that look at all of the prevalence of medical conditions, so we can look at those together if you'd like at the break, or I'll refer you to the report because all of the medical conditions that we looked at are broken down that way.
All right. Our last speaker for this panel is Dr. Sanderson, who's a professor of biosystems and agricultural engineering in the College of Ag, Food, and Environment at the University of Kentucky. He was a commissioned officer in the U.S. Public Health Service for 24 years before coming to academia. Of course, he is the director of the Central Appalachian Regional Education Research Center, and the director of Southeast Center for Agricultural Health and Injury Prevention. I think you know a lot about what he's doing here, so in order to save time and have him actually have time to present, I'll turn it over to you right now.
Okay, thanks, Terry. Thanks a lot. This shows why I love this conference so much. It's small, and it brings together people so that if you're interested in this area of work at all, your wheels ought to be spinning. I didn't even know, she's right there on my campus. I didn't know the great work that Dr. Pope was doing. And I think with my talk, you can see how it ties in with the kind of stuff that we want to do. I'm going to focus today on roadway accidents and farm and logging equipment. But I think that we can use models, this great study that from Virginia Tech. Virginia Tech is one of the top transportation research centers in the country. I've reviewed several of their papers, as well as been a review on some of your grants too, and they always turn out outstanding quality work. Let me see if I can get this thing to work here. Yeah. Just want to kind of focus a bit on roadway crashes and agriculture and logging equipment. I'll tell you why we came to this point with our ERC and our Ag Center. I think you all know this. The number of farms in the United States is dramatically decreasing. It has decreased so much since 1970 and present days. We're talking millions of farms. We're now a little stable. We're staying right around 2 million farms in the United States. Okay, and you can look at this map. It shows where the farms are. And the blue dots, I'm not trying to focus down too much, but just look at the Southeast, our region. We're an intensely agricultural, rural area with lots of farms. And these tend to be relatively small farms. But what I mean by the number of farms decreasing, this means that people have to travel. Whoop, what did I do? Oh, there we go. That's the number of farms is decreasing. This means that people have to travel from one place to another. This means that what has happened is those farmers that used to have a quarter section of 160 acres or a half section of 320 acres or even a full section of 640 acres, they may still own that land, but they tend to be renting it out to the larger and larger farmers, which are now farming 10, 20,000 acres. So these large farmers are spending a good bit of time traveling from one location to another. And this is a very common sight that we have in our region. You see, this happens to be a large combine without its header on, but it could be tractors, it could be any number of farm implements going down the road. And what do you see behind it? Is a lot of cars, because these are traveling maybe 20, 25 miles an hour. And many of these roadways, particularly if they're a major highway like this one, it's at least a 55-mile-an-hour zone. And so it's ideally set up for a roadway crash to happen. Now, what you don't see quite as much as this was an investigation I was involved in Iowa 20 years ago when I first went there. You don't see the old tricycle tractors quite as much. They're pretty much gone. You're seeing fewer and fewer tractors without ROPS on them, but they're still out there. We don't see that quite as much. We do still see this, not on roadways, where the smaller equipment has been used to mow around ditch banks or ponds or really small activities. And we still do see the overturns, but my focus is more on roadway crashes involving agricultural equipment. So we have a surveillance program too. Because ag surveillance, I think Dr. Pope pointed out, those of you who are involved in surveillance, it's hard. It is really hard to do it well, but it's incredibly valuable. And why is it valuable? It's because it gives us the idea of what sorts of things we should be working on. And then once we try something, like interventions that are going to spin out of these projects that we talked about this morning, they tell us if they did any good. Were they effective, and how effective were they? Well, because ag surveillance in particular is so difficult to do, because workers' comp doesn't exist, right? OSHA inspections doesn't exist. So what we did some years ago is we started in the 10-state Southeast region about 3 years ago. We've been doing press clips. Now that means that we have You probably have seen these advertisements, make money while you're at home, and they bring you a stack of newspapers, and people hire you to go through and cut out all the news articles related to a topic. So we have all the newspapers in the Southeast that we can, in this system, where people cut out stories on fatalities related to agriculture. And it's not, and it's not a complete set, but I think it would tie in directly. We could look for completeness. We've collaborated with folks at Marshfield Clinic in Wisconsin, which are doing ag surveillance in the upper Midwest, helps them kind of determine if there's completeness in their database. And sometimes we find fatalities that they didn't know about. The other thing press clips sometimes do is they give you more information than might be in the database. So can we learn anything from it? Well, yeah, what we can kind of learn is that rear-end collisions tend to be the number one cause of the fatalities. And then this is the percentage of other things that have happened. Collisions in general, head-on collisions and overturns, or people going around a slow-moving vehicle. We've been working with the folks at the Kentucky State Department for Agriculture. This is actually an event that we noticed that where they went out with EMS, and of course, you can see how this is a common sort of situation. You've got basically a manure spreading wagon. You can see the injectors maybe on the back. It's dark, and a slow-moving vehicle going down a major highway, and a truck runs in underneath them. This is not all that uncommon an occurrence in Kentucky, and what we've done is we have now been doing, now this is staged. We've been working with all of the EMS folks to produce trainings for how to extract people from these sorts of things. And this is great for the end result, but we're more interested in how to prevent these things. These events, we have about actually one a year. Seems like about one a year. We work in various locations in Kentucky. EMS officers, it tends in probably in a lot of your states too, 80% of the emergency response personnel, EMS and fire, are volunteer. They give up their weekend to come in and try and figure out ways to extract people from these kinds of situations. So what have we seen from major causes of these events? There's been a number of research studies out of the University of Iowa in particular on the causes. We haven't done, at least I haven't run across the papers on this much in the Southeast area. If you're aware of people focusing on ag equipment, I did not see the papers. But certainly, University of Iowa has produced probably at least a half a dozen or more papers on this particular topic. Age of the drivers tends to be a major risk factor. The very young and the very old tend to be the greatest at risk. Condition of the equipment, if they don't use seat belts, ROPS, or have good lighting and marking, often leads to a greater risk for an injury in the accident. Clearly, you would expect this. Planting and harvesting season, when farmers are eager to get into the field and move their equipment around, are greatest risk factors. The weather, wet surfaces, visibility, darkness, and whether the roadway has hills, curves, or crossroads, and then the roadway characteristics itself. The rural roads where the people tend to drive 30, 35 miles an hour, not quite as much. It tends to be where people are used to driving 55, 60 miles an hour down the road, where they're more likely to run into a vehicle. All right, so what is our role? Dr. Kane mentioned it. It's intervention, right? We want to come up with some intervention projects that we might try, and then have our surveillance systems evaluate their effectiveness. One is one of the surveys that we've done is, did you know that the little driver's manual that you have to read in order to take a written test, in some states, there's no mention of slow-moving vehicles at all. So we do think that there are areas. Kentucky has one. It's not very much, but there's a little bit written on being aware of slow-moving vehicles. We did notice that in Iowa, it must have been about 2007 or so, the legislature, the Department of Transportation changed the manual and increased training in high schools on slow-moving vehicles, and we did see a somewhat of a drop in rates of accidents associated with ag equipment. Improved lighting and marking. I don't think there's any manufacturers here, but those of you who've driven on rural roads at planting and harvest season, lighting and marking has dramatically changed. I mean, now some of these, at least particularly at night, they have the ambulance-like lights on top. Those have been great benefits to decreasing increasing the visibility of these vehicles on roadways. Public service announcements. Actually, a farmer who's on our board, external advisory board, every spring and every fall, they pay to put out announcements in the local newspaper, warning people that, hey, be aware, we're on the road, share the road with us. We want you to be aware that we have to move from farm to farm, and please slow down and be aware that we're on the road. I gave a talk similar to this just a few weeks ago, and a gentleman for a radio station came up and said, what about us doing radio spots every spring and every fall? I said, that's a great project for my intervention friends. Write the spots. We'll figure out how to fund them and see if that does any good. And then finally, and I think Courtney mentioned this, what about GIS mapping? What about improving roadway visibility? Where are these accidents happening? Are they in locations where visibility is probably the weakest, so that we need to do something related to that? Okay, finally, where does this lead? We're proposing to do a roadway regional symposium this August. We just, Dr. Oldham just came out with a save the date announcement. I think we'll be sending this out. If it's not gone out widely, it'll soon be going out. It's in partnership with our colleagues at Virginia Tech. We're looking for other colleagues to participate with us. The idea of this symposium will be the first day will be kind of hash some of the surveillance out. What are the risk factors? What are the major causes of roadway crashes? But the second day is really meant for us to explore interventions and ways that we can potentially get those funded, and then see how effective that they might be in this regard. So that's my presentation. Thanks.
Quick question regarding the accident rates that you had on there. You were mentioning that the typical accidents were happening with the very young and very old. Would that be the drivers of the farm equipment or the people that are hitting the farm equipment?
It's the farm equipment. Yeah, that was a good point to separate that out. We still see young teenagers, driving farm equipment on roadway. Pretty sizable equipment sometimes. And then since I'm in this sector, when we stratify the data 65 and above, you don't hear as well, you don't see as well, you don't react as well. Even though we think we do, we don't. My wife is smiling at me because she doesn't let me drive her new pickup truck, by the way. So.
Back here. I was just wondering, as far as maybe a civil engineering solution to this. I mean, maybe having another road perhaps would be maybe a solution. Do you think there are any civil engineering solutions outside of just having them kind of drive on the road and people watch out for them?
Well, I think it's multifactorial. I think everything, and that's why I think looking at where these crashes are occurring, and I haven't seen any papers that have really done that, by the way, Courtney, if you're interested in geocoding these sorts of things, is I don't think what you're going to see is there's just this one spot in Kentucky where all the crap. I think you're going to see the characteristics. So like one of the things that I don't know you would call it from a civil engineering as working with agriculture in general, is the incentive nowadays is to plant right up to the roadway edge. And you know what happens with corn when it gets to be about July or August? You can't see. You cannot see. And then, of course, there's other situations where I think they're really dangerous curves. They're hills that you can't see over. And I think that looking at those kinds of things. Now, a separate roadway for farm equipment, not sure that financially we can afford that. But I think we need all partners at the table, and engineers and in general. Those of you who grew up more in my cohort, you remember it wasn't uncommon to drive a tractor with not only no ROP, but it had one headlight in the front and one headlight in the back, and no other markings on it, no reflectors at all. That was it. And so I think the mechanical engineers, your colleagues in mechanical engineering have gone to work for the big implement companies, have dramatically changed that. So yes, definitely by all means, engineers have a seat at the table.
It may be too hard to parse from the data, but have you had any information regarding distracted driving from individuals who may be driving the farm equipment? Especially if I'm thinking about like the younger drivers in general. We know it's hard to track in vehicles, but I would assume it's probably the same issue with farming equipment.
I think it's the same issue, and I think those are the kinds of things that we need to explore more.
So I know you were talking about with your data, there was like a season where you would typically see these farmers out on the roads. Did you happen to see like a time variance?
Oh yeah. I mean, that's one of the questions that that I think needs explored. Darkness is a factor, right? So you think about the scenario. You got done in this field, and you're going to move to the next field, and you want to be there by daylight. So you decide it's about dusk. It's about 8:30, 9 o'clock at night, and you're going to move 10 miles down to the road to your next farm, so you're ready to go in the morning. Well, one advantage of that is there tends to be less traffic at dusk and nighttime, right? But there's also less visibility. So particularly if you're going on a roadway, now this is where maybe the engineers can come in, is figure out rerouting, for example, my folks' farm is just a mile off Route 62, an old 2-lane road. People do 70, 75 miles an hour on this old 2-lane road. They do. Okay, and it's also hilly, and there's also a lot of curves. And so if it's dark and we're moving our equipment, it would not surprise me at all if someone comes over that hill and they really can't see the tractor driving 20 miles an hour. So yeah, try guidance on when you're on certain roads at what time of day. I think is a critical question that needs to be explored, and where we might be able to use this. You know, my press clips data may not have time of day, but I think linking in with other surveillance databases might give us more detailed police reports, things like that might give us more detailed information to try and explore those questions.
I agree. Thank you.
Yeah.